So you want to create an engaging composition that's going to lead the viewer into the painting. If you're experiencing roadblocks with your landscape paintings and you can't seem to paint the landscapes that you'd imagined, perhaps your paintings look completely flat or your artwork's just plateaued, then these 10 landscape painting tips will help to skyrocket your painting skills. So then, tip number 1, choose your subject carefully. Now when choosing a subject to paint, it might not necessarily translate that well on a canvas. Say for example, if you were painting a landscape that's fully bathed in the full sun and there's not any shadows in it, then it might look good when you see it in real life, but when you come to paint it, you might have trouble trying to make the whole thing have depth and make it look realistic. Now having things like shadows in your painting can really help create that three-dimensional effect in your painting and also help to create atmospheric depth. So when you choose a subject, choose something that's exciting as well, like some rolling hills, trees, some mountains, or perhaps something that's going to lead the viewer into your painting, like a road or a river, for example. That will help with the composition. So that this is something to be mindful of when you come to choose a subject for a landscape painting. Tip number 2, and I would say this is an essential tip, and that's to start sketching. Now you'd be amazed at the number of landscape artists that don't do any sketching before they get into a painting, and you can see it in their artwork. Often, say when I'm scrolling through Instagram for example, I can see in people's paintings whether they'd done some prior planning or not, or whether they just got straight into it, because it shows straight away in the composition. So why sketch? Well, when you sketch, it helps with your drawing skills, which is going to help with your painting skills, but it helps you to plan the road ahead so you can start designing the composition for your painting. Because a landscape painting is not just about the colours and tones that you're using, it's also about the composition. So you want to create an engaging composition that's going to lead the viewer into the painting. Now sketching serves a number of purposes. Firstly, as I said, it improves your drawing skills. Secondly, it helps you to design your composition. But another reason for sketching is it starts to help you to understand the values in the landscape, and value is how light or dark your subject is. So this is what's going to help you to make your landscape painting look realistic and have depth within it. And the general rule is we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground, and then as landforms recede, the darks aren't as dark and the lights are not as light. So we can start to understand this in our sketchbook. Now what I normally do is I do a load of quick 15-minute thumbnail sketches. These are pretty small, and I'll just start marking down some ideas for some composition. And usually once I've started doing a few of these thumbnail sketches, I'll start getting a feel for what the scene is that I'm sketching and what I want to paint, and then I'll start getting some more ideas and just developing it more. Once this is done, I'll then do a main sketch, and this is what I'm going to refer to for when I start my painting. Now as I said, when I sketch, it helps me to understand the tonal values in the scene that I'm painting. So being able to create depth in that sketch where you've eliminated colour out of the equation. In my opinion, the tonal values are more important than the colour mixing. Now, as I say, I think it's essential to do sketches, and if you start sketching, it will set you apart from most other landscape artists. So start doing this now. Tip number 3, consider the composition and the focal points. So this actually leads on from sketching. It's really important that we have an engaging composition that's pleasing to the viewer when we create a painting. You know what, I've seen so many landscape paintings that are superbly painted and look awesome, and yet they've been totally let down by bad compositions. I even met one guy who was selling his paintings for a lot of money, and he was boasting about the fact that he never did any sketches for his compositions or never planned any of his compositions. And I looked at his paintings and I just thought, yeah, I can tell, because his paintings were filled with compositional errors. So this is really important. So when we're sketching our composition, we want a main area of interest or focal area, and then we want some supporting elements that are going to subtly lead the eye towards it. We can also have some secondary areas of interest as well. So this could be something like a road or a river that's leading the eye towards your focal area. It could be a stand of trees. It could be some light on a mountain, for example. But as I say, we want to have something that's going to subtly lead the eye towards your focal area and also keep the viewer's eye on the canvas. Now, there are some things to avoid in composition, such as having centered objects. This is really displeasing. It causes a displeasing static in the painting. We don't want to have the horizon line in the middle of the picture, so it's equally dividing the canvas in half. You want either a higher horizon or a lower horizon. We need to be careful of lines and vectors because they have strong eye carrying power, can easily carry your eye off the canvas. So even with things like mountains or hills that you're painting, for example, you could soften the edges of them, especially towards the edges of the canvas. The other thing we don't want is repeating objects or masses. This is easily done with things like rocks or tufts of grass or bushes or things like that, so that's something to be mindful of. Tip number 4, simplify the scene. Now, many artists copy from photographs, including myself. I also do plein air painting as well, but I've seen also many landscape artists trying to shove everything in the actual scene that they're painting. They're copying everything exactly from the photograph, and then it can end up with a displeasing composition, or a composition that's just got too much going on in it, too much information, you're not sure where to look, and overall it's just disharmony in the painting. So for this reason, we want to simplify the scene. So don't be afraid to take elements or take things out of the painting. We can add some things in as well. They could be some elements from other photographs, for example. We're not trying to create a photograph here, we're trying to create a painting. And often simple is more effective, less is more. So with my landscape paintings, I try to simplify the scene where possible so that it's more engaging. I had an artist friend tell me that it's not about what he puts in the painting, but what he takes out, and that stuck with me when he said that. Tip number 5, paint a value study. Now, as I said earlier, value refers to how light or dark your subject is, and this is what's going to help to create the depth in your paintings and make them look realistic. Now, I've met a lot of artists that are struggling with colour mixing, and they don't realise as well that they're also struggling with tonal values, and that's what's going to create the depth in your painting. So normally I think the best thing to do is focus more on the values. Whenever I paint an artwork, I think in terms of value rather than colour. Of course, colour mixing is important as well. But if you're struggling creating depth in your painting, then an exercise that you can do is to paint a value study. And this is where you literally paint the scene that you're going to paint, but in black and white, using only 3 colours. And these 3 colours include ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and titanium white. Now, with ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, when you combine these 2 colours together, you can create a near black. And this is because burnt sienna is actually a dark orange, and orange is opposite to blue on the colour wheel. Then when you add titanium white, we can create some greys, some mid-tones, some light greys with them, and generally natural looking greys that you'd find in the landscape. So this exercise of painting a value study helps you to understand the lights and darks in the scene, but it also can help you with your colour mixing, because these 3 colours, I use them as part of my palette anyway, so it starts getting you familiar with mixing shadow tones, for example, that you can use when you're using your full palette of colours. So this can help you, as I said, with your colour mixing. Now, you don't have to do a value study every time you do a painting, but if you're learning, it's worth doing a couple of them just to help you to understand the lights and darks in the scene and create that atmospheric depth in your paintings. Tip number 6, use fewer colours. Now, years ago, I used to use a lot of colours on my palette, and I found that my paintings were a little bit disharmonious, as in there wasn't the full colour harmony there. Now, we can achieve colour harmony in our paintings by using common colours throughout. So what it is you should be able to look at a painting and think, wow, it just looks beautiful and everything works. And this is often because there's colour harmony where common colours have been used throughout the painting. So when you use fewer colours, it means you're more likely to be using the colours that you do have on your palette in your painting. So it starts to tie all the zones together. So for example, I use ultramarine blue and titanium white in the sky. I'm using it in the clouds. I'm using it in the shadow areas of the hills or mountains. I can use it in the trees. I can use it in rocks. And it's just tying all the zones together because I'm using these common colours throughout. I found that my artwork improved my colour mixing improved when I started using fewer colours. My colours look cleaner, and also my knowledge of colour mixing and understanding of colour also improved. Tip number 7, paint on a white surface. Now over the years I've watched other artists' videos, and many of them are painting on a toned surface, so they're toning the canvas with a layer of burnt sienna or burnt umber, something like that. It creates a mid-tone and it can help with tonal values. The other thing it does is warm up the painting as it comes through the paint layers. I actually used to do this myself, and you can see that when you watch my earlier YouTube videos. And actually there's nothing wrong with toning your canvas at all. However, I started to find that I had many issues when I used to do this, and that my darks were coming out too dark. I watched another artist's video who used to do this as well, and he said he'd end up getting lost in his darks, i.e. his darks were coming out too dark. And I thought, man, I had that same problem. I've seen it in many of my students where they're toning their canvases and then the colours just look off, they can look a bit acidic, the values are too dark and they're struggling. So this is why I suggest painting on a white surface, and I've gone back to doing this in general for most of my paintings. Sometimes I still paint on a toned surface now and again from time to time, but not normally. I paint on a white surface, and ever since I've gone back to painting on a white surface, I found that my colours look cleaner, but also my tonal values and depth in my paintings look better as well, and I'm not having to go back and make value readjustments in my artwork. So when I paint, I start off by painting the dark values first. I'll paint my darkest darks, and I can gauge that off the white of the canvas, and then paint all the other mid-tones in there and immediately create that depth in my painting to work towards. So as I say, especially if you're learning, paint on a white surface, your colours will be cleaner, you'll find it easier to create all the shadows in the scene that you're painting and create depth. At least just do this whilst you're learning. Later on, if you want to experiment, try painting on a toned surface just to see what the effects are. But if you're learning, I would say paint on a white surface. So I hope you're enjoying the video so far. Now, are you struggling with your landscape paintings? Perhaps you're not able to paint the artworks that you'd imagined in your head, or you're struggling with composition, tonal values and colour mixing. Well, let me help you. Download my free Landscape Painter's Blueprint. What this does is it provides you with a solid methodology for painting that's going to give you predictable results with your artworks. Inside, I explain my process of how I select photos, do sketches, design composition, so I'll give you some composition ideas in there, then also colour mixing, understanding tonal values, and then there's also a painting demonstration at the end of it. So if you'd like that free guide, the Landscape Painting Blueprint, just click the link below. As I say, it's there for you for free. Tip number 8, when you start a painting, paint your dark values first. Now, many landscape artists will start a painting with the sky and then they'll work their way forward. And there's nothing wrong with doing this. I'm not knocking it or anything. In fact, I used to paint this way myself, but there is a danger that you can start off by painting your sky and clouds too dark, which means the background hills need to be darker. And then by the time you've got to the midground, you might have exhausted all your dark values and you can't go any darker to paint the shadows in the foreground. So that's the danger of painting the sky first and then working your way forward. So the easiest thing to do is to paint your dark values and shadows first. So start with your darkest darks. This is normally to be found in the foreground, and you can gauge those darks off the white of your canvas, which again is why you should paint on a white surface. It's just going to make everything easier. Then once you've painted those dark shadows, they could be in a tree for example, or they could be in some rocks. Then as you work your way into the distance, you paint the shadows that you see there. So these could be shadows in hills or mountains or distant trees, but those shadows are going to be getting lighter. And then by the time you come to paint your cloud shadows, you'll be able to get the tonality of the sky and clouds correct as well. Now, clouds are usually quite light in value, but the cloud shadows, I still include those with the darks. Now, I learnt this from painting on plein air, outdoors, painting outdoors. And the reason that it's easier to paint your dark values first is because the light is always changing when you're painting outdoors, and quite often it can cloud over. But if you've painted your darks first, it makes it so much easier to paint the areas in light afterwards, and then it doesn't matter if the sun disappears behind the clouds or the light's changed. You've already established where all your shadows are. Now, I started doing this in the studio as well, so I paint the studio artwork pretty much in the same way as a plein air painting, and I just found that the whole process was easier and I wasn't having to go back and make tonal readjustments in my painting. So this is something I really would strongly recommend. Tip number 9, don't get caught up in the details. Now, I've seen a lot of landscape artists that paint with loads and loads of detail, and they're all about detail, which is cool because you're sort of telling the viewer everything that's in the painting, but very often it's much better if you hold off on the detail and not use so much of it. For me, when I'm scrolling through Instagram and looking at artists' paintings, it's usually the plein air painters that jump out at me, and the reason being is because their paintings are often loose and gestural. They're full of life and vitality, and generally there's not all that much detail in them. In fact, a lot of these paintings look detailed when they're viewed from a distance, but then up close you can see that there's not all that much detail in them. So we want to give the viewer something to think about, because the human brain will fill in a lot of that information. So when I start a painting, instead of using a small brush, which I've seen a lot of artists do, where they're just using a small brush and it's just a painful, laborious way to paint an artwork, in my opinion. But what I do is I use larger brushes, especially flat brushes, and I'll use the biggest brushes that I can get away with, and I'll start my painting with loose gestural brush marks, and it's just going to give life to the whole painting. Now you can always afterwards, once it's dry, add some layers and add a bit of detail. That's totally cool. In fact, you can go as detailed as you like, but start off your paintings just loose and gestural and work towards loosening up your brushwork anyway. Less is more, and in fact I had an artist friend say to me that what takes most artists 10 brush strokes to make, he tries to say it in 1. So it's all about limiting your brush strokes, making them with intention, and just loosening up your artworks. Now then, the last tip, save your lightest values until the end. Save it till last. So what do I mean by this? So when I'm painting an artwork, as I said, I think more in terms of tonal values rather than colour. Now, of course, the colour mixing is important as well, but I'm thinking about the lights and darks always. So what I do, in order to create more depth in my painting, I keep my paintings tonally a little bit darker to begin with, especially in the blocking stage. So I won't use my lightest lights just yet. I want to keep the whole painting tonally darker so they've got plenty of room to add lighter layers of paint as I work through the painting. Often I'm painting in layers, so I'll let the previous layer dry and then I'll add fresh layers of paint on top. And as I do, when it comes to painting the lights, I'll be progressively adding lighter layers of paint. Then when it comes to finishing the painting, so this is where I'll be adding my lightest value colour, and this could be something like snow on a mountain, where I would have painted the snow previously and just made it a bit darker, but then I'm just adding a few highlights in the snow, and this would just be titanium white with a little bit of yellow ochre mixed in. Same with the seascape as well, painting the white water and foam on the breaking waves, for example. Keep them a bit darker as I work through the painting, wait for it to dry, and then when it comes to adding those final layers of paint, just a few highlights with pure titanium white and a bit of yellow ochre. Adding those highlights is what's going to make the whole thing pop. So as I say, as you're working through your paintings, keep them tonally a little bit darker and then just build up those lighter layers. You don't want to blow out your whole tonal range in the early stages. Then, as I say, save the lightest values until the end and your paintings will pop. So I hope you found this video helpful. As I say, get your free landscape painting blueprint that's going to help you with your landscape painting. Link is in the description box below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.